goes through the pushback, and you wonder if she would get the same pushback if she were a man, right? You wonder it all the time. You wrote about a young woman who's experiencing that, and she is still a child, and her name is Greta Thunberg, and I love that you included her here. This is actually one of my favorite essays in the book. Talk a little bit about not only standing up for yourself, but as a young woman who's fighting for something huge and important, and doing that despite the fact that people are, I mean, the viciousness of the attacks against her have been something, I mean, you can probably
I have a little idea what that's
a little bit.
And so do you, I know. We included Greta in the book before she sailed across the ocean and spoke at the UN, because we were both so impressed with her lonely campaign to raise awareness about what needs to be done to try to stop the effects of climate change, frankly, before it's too late for many parts of the world. You know, she started off going on her own to the government buildings in Stockholm, and she was literally by herself, and nobody joined her. And then eventually a couple of kids joined her, and then, as we know, it led to a global effort to raise awareness about climate change that enlisted millions of young people. There were several things that I think we both were drawn to when it came to including Greta. First, that she was just unapologetically a 16-year-old girl. She didn't pretend to be anybody else but herself. And she very quickly told people that she was autistic. She had a form of autism on the Asperger's spectrum, and she owned up to it. And she was, again, fearless and unapologetic. And then as we watched her be willing to put herself out there, to speak truth to power, and engender wild support, great adulation from those who saw what she was trying to do and believed in her, and then the most negative, vicious attacks on her girlhood, on her autism, on how she spoke, and everything else that the other side could think of to try to diminish her, it just made us even more proud that we'd included her. But I think that for both of us, she was a real example of what young women are doing around the world on a lot of important issues.
Yeah. And also the need to stand up for facts and science. And that she just is so kind of consistently and persistently clear that she's not voicing her opinions. You know, she is amplifying and elevating kind of what the overwhelming majority of scientists are telling us about climate change, and kind of what they are kind of urging and exhorting us to do, what we must do. And Joy, just since kind of we're here tonight, I want to mention Tony Pergolin and Judy London, who are from Bancroft, because one of the women that we write about in the book is Margaret Bancroft, who kind of in the late mid-19th century, when she was a teacher here in Pennsylvania, believed that every child deserved the right to an education, and that every child could learn. And that was not the prevailing view at the time. And when she said she wanted to start kind of her own school to be able to kind of bring that philosophy into the world, that regardless of ability, every child could learn, you know, she was also really derided and denigrated and told, like, why would she bother? Like, why would she bother with these kids? And she just was dogged and determined, and the school and organization that she started still exists today, and among its many kind of achievements is one of the largest sources of American Special Olympians, which I think is pretty fantastic.
So one of the things I enjoyed the most about the book is it's sort of a catalog of a lot of, my heroines, Shirley Chisholm probably being, growing up, like the biggest hero in my household. She's part Guyanese. My mom's a bit biased. Mae Jemison, like people like that. But I love the fact that you also, in some parts of the book, combine someone known with someone who is less known. People should know Claudette Colvin, but people tend not to, and they tend to, know Rosa Parks. Everybody knows who Rosa Parks is. She decided she didn't want to sit in the back of the bus, but the fact that Claudette Colvin was another teenager who did it first, I love that you all included her.
So I think that Claudette Colvin is one of the great heroes in American history that we don't talk about, and she is someone that I think everyone should learn about in school, and I'm so thankful to my 8th grade history teacher in Little Rock, Arkansas, at Horseman Junior High School for teaching me about Claudette Colvin. Because as Joy said, 9 months before Rosa Parks, Claudette stayed seated on the bus. She was on her way home from school, and a white woman got on the bus and told her she had to get up, and she refused to get up. And as she later said, she felt like she had Harriet Tubman on one shoulder and Sojourner Truth on the other shoulder, just holding her down in her seat. And she just knew that she couldn't get up. She was arrested. She was dragged off the bus. She was horrifically treated while she was in jail. Her father and the local pastor had to plea and work and raise money to help get her out of jail. She gets out of jail. People tell her she needs to be quiet, and she just says no. And so she became one of the original plaintiffs, one of the 5 original plaintiffs in Browder v. Gale, which was the ruling ultimately, by a district court, upheld by the Supreme Court, that said no, like bus segregation is illegal. It's illegal in Montgomery, and it's illegal in the state of Alabama. And so while we know Rosa Parks' name, really justly, we should know Claudette's too. She was 15, and her story is part of what propelled, finally, desegregating public transportation in Alabama.
Yep. And there's a clap. You include some of the people that are some of my have become some of my favorite people, the young women of the Parkland students, who are so brave and who came forward and became the face of really probably the most successful, I think, to date, gun reform movement, really since 1994, when there was an assault weapons ban actually somehow passed the Congress. When you look at this kind of advocacy, particularly since you've spent so much time in public policy, people tend not to think that there will be anything actually done. These kids don't believe that.
Right. Well, gun violence is a huge issue for both Chelsea and me, and we wrote about 2 groups of women, and I'll speak about the older generation, and Chelsea will speak about the younger, which is totally appropriate, I think. And as Joy said, one of the characteristics of all these women in our book, despite whatever obstacles they faced or how badly they were treated, is optimism. They really believe that something will change and that they're going to play a role in making sure that it does. So we highlight women who've been involved in the gun violence prevention efforts for quite some time. Women like Sarah Brady, whose husband James was so severely wounded when there was the assassination attempt against President Reagan. Paralyzed in a wheelchair, Sarah Brady became the voice of gun reform, and she really was instrumental in getting the Brady Bill passed, which also passed in 1994 that my husband signed, and it has kept something like 2.5 million people from getting guns who shouldn't. Just imagine that, because they've been stopped at that process. Or Gabby Giffords, who was herself the victim of an assassination attempt. And after being so profoundly wounded and working so hard to come back through physical therapy and speech therapy, she and her wonderful husband, Mark Kelly, have been leading the charge for sensible gun legislation. And Nelba Marquez Green, whose little girl was murdered at Sandy Hook, and who talks about the burdens and the pain that family members feel. And Lucy McBath, whose son Jordan was killed for playing music too loud in his car. And the man did go to prison, thankfully, but Lucy despite being devastated by the terrible murder of her son, said she had to do something, and she became a gun prevention activist, and now she's a member of Congress. So we try to talk about, you know, women who have been on the front lines and have often taken their own tragedies and tried to convince people that something had to be done. But this group of young people, like what Joy was talking about, are really a new phenomenon. They came out of Parkland, they came out of other gun-related tragedies, and they are absolutely determined that it's going to be a voting issue and that people are going to get the changes that they are seeking to try to save lives.
And we highlight 6 young women activists because while I think so much attention has kind of been focused on the Parkland students and on Emma Gonzalez, you know, what I think has been really remarkable about the Parkland students is how they have, from the beginning of dealing with this horrific tragedy that affected all of them, understood that they were not the only ones who were affected. And they really have not only shared the spotlight, but given their platform to others who are working on different aspects of our kind of gun violence epidemic in our country. And so, you know, we write about Naomi Wadler, whose mother had gone to high school with Fred Gutenberg, whose daughter was murdered at Parkland. And kind of as Naomi was learning about this horror and how it affected her family, she felt like she had to do something. So at 11 years old, you know, she started her own school strike of kind of kids walking out, kind of protesting gun violence. And then she spoke at kind of March for Our Lives about the need to really understand, in so many instances, it's black girls who suffer the highest rates of gun violence in our country. And we also write about Jasmine Wildcat, who has really taken on kind of the challenges of gun violence, not only in her own Native American community, but in other Native American communities. You know, we write about Julia Spohr, who my mother and I met a few days ago in Washington, D.C., whose father died by suicide, kind of with a gun. And you know, she and her mother had kind of worked to raise awareness of the suicide epidemic in our country. And then after the tragedy in Parkland, she felt like she had to do more, and she started Students Demand Action, which now has more than 40,000 members. So just kind of these young women, Joy, who are not only kind of determined to change the status quo, are racing ahead and supporting each other to do so kind of at every level of government with every opportunity. And I just am in awe of them, and particularly as a mother, incredibly grateful to them.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, speaking of women who made history, you do write about Frances Perkins, who's the reason we have Social Security. We can give that a help. Oh, we do love Social Security, right? We can give that a help. And you write about women, you know, from this era when women were not supposed to be part of government, were not supposed to be making decisions. So I'm going to set that aside. I'd love for you to talk about Frances Perkins and why she, and you write about Eleanor Roosevelt, who I know is your idol. We're here in the National Constitution Center. So I want to ask you, as somebody who is an attorney, as somebody who was an attorney on that commission that looked at Richard Nixon's potential crimes and what needed to be done with him, whether or not, you know, the idea of gutsy women, right, is that you're standing up to power, that you're standing up for the people who are in need, which is what Ms. Perkins managed to do. I wonder if you see the same kind of potential and resiliency to overcome what really feels to a lot of people, I think, like a constitutional crisis right now. And if so, who is it? Who do you see out there now that has the strength to stand up really for the Constitution, given the state of affairs in 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue?
Well, how appropriate that we would talk about a constitutional crisis such as the one we are in right here at the Constitution Center. And I want to thank Jeffrey Rosen for his leadership and for what this center really means. It's a living, breathing reminder of how the Constitution was created and how we have not only tried to change it in ways that furthered the underlying ideals of our country, but also tried to understand what it is our founders were teaching us when we look at it. And there is a reason there is a section on impeachment in the Constitution. And as Joy said, I had the rather unusual experience of being on the impeachment inquiry staff back in 1974 investigating Richard Nixon. And one of my assignments as a young lawyer was to write the memo that was later published with a few other of my colleagues about what is a high crime and misdemeanor. And clearly the founders said to themselves, look, we're going to have elections, and that will represent, we hope, the will of the people. But in between elections, if we have a leader who is abusing power, obstructing justice, treating the rest of the government with contempt, we have to have a remedy. And so impeachment, rooted in sort of Anglo-Saxon law going back to the English, became the remedy that the founders put into our Constitution. Now, why is that important? Because if you go back and you read some of the early debates and some of the writings around the Constitution, what was one thing they were particularly worried about? They were worried about foreign interference in the government. They were worried that foreign powers would try to subvert the government of the United States through influencing elected leaders or appointed leaders. It was a very real concern to our founders. And so we are now at the point where we have an impeachment inquiry beginning. Evidence is being presented and being evaluated. And then the House will have to make a decision as to whether or not there is enough evidence to support articles of impeachment. Personally, I think that there's a really good case that there is enough evidence to support articles of impeachment. So, and I think it's really important, as Joy was asking, to look at the people who are now on the leading edge of this momentous, historic moment. And the person who's furthest out is the Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, who is a very gutsy woman, and she has really tried very hard to handle this and with the seriousness and deliberativeness that it requires. But what is particularly missing are any people in the opposite party who are speaking up. Because back in 1974, Republican members of the House of Representatives who served on the Judiciary Committee voted for the articles of impeachment. Republican senators, after the House Judiciary Committee vote, went to see Richard Nixon and said, you should resign for the good of the country. They put country over party. We write about a woman who does that in our book, Margaret Chase Smith, the Republican senator from Maine, who was the first member of her party to take on Joseph McCarthy. And she gave a stunning speech on the floor of the Senate, speaking about how important it was to not only take him on for the good of the country, but for the good of the Republican Party. And if you go back and you read that, and we quote from it in the book, you have to ask yourself, where is anybody from the Republican Party willing to be the Margaret Chase Smith? You know, there's one obvious candidate who happens to be a woman Republican senator from Maine who could take on that role, but there are others as well. And so it is especially important at this moment for citizens to educate themselves, to learn about what impeachment is and what it isn't, to understand the reason the founders put it in the document to begin with, and to follow the evidence, because we're getting more and more evidence all the time about abuse of power, about obstruction of justice, and about contempt of Congress. And this assault on our rule of law and our checks and balances among the three branches of government is a serious threat to our democracy and to our Constitution.
Thank you. To stay on the constitutional question just for a moment, another, issue that has come up from time to time, and I have some great women lawyer friends or constitutional lawyers who worry a bit about the process of it, but the Equal Rights Amendment comes up from time to time. I know it's come up before, and the idea of going back and looking at the Constitution and putting it in explicit protection for women. The risk of that, of course, is if you open up the Constitution to a convention, all sorts of things that you might not want might wind up also debated and wind up in there. Do you think, just looking at it from your point of view, is that risk worth it? I think it's 33 or 34 states that have already ratified it.
Well, there's two ways to amend the Constitution, one through a convention and one through the process that the Equal Rights Amendment was following, which is to have states vote in favor of it. And you're right, we're very close in the number of states that are needed to add the Equal Rights Amendment. So you wouldn't have to go the convention route, which I do think, given the passions of our time, would be a very difficult process, to say the least. What right now we're trying to do is defend the Constitution we've got and try to make sure that its principles are respected. So I do think that there was a hope that Virginia would have passed it. That was one of the states that people were hoping for. It may be that after this next election, because Virginia elects their state legislature in the off years, so they're actually having an election in November, there might be enough votes to revisit it. And I know that the people who are advocating for it in Virginia intend to do that. So it is unfinished business because we write about the suffrage movement, and there's a really important story to be talked about and discussed and taught in schools, because next year is the 100th anniversary of women in the United States getting the right to vote. And it was so hard, and it took so long, and even once it was achieved, black women, Native American women, Latino women were often prevented from voting, even though they had the constitutional right. It's just been so difficult to get equality under the Constitution because, originally, as Barbara Jordan famously says in this great speech she gave when she voted for the articles of impeachment against Nixon, and we quote some of it in the book because she's one of my personal heroines. She said, when that Constitution was written, I was not included. And for the longest time, I thought George Washington and Alexander Hamilton had just overlooked me. But then we kept going, and we kept adding people. And now, it is more inclusive, but we have to protect it. We can't take it for granted. So I think there's still work that should be done, but in the right way, so it doesn't cause more problems.
And Joy, one of the really kind of vigorous proponents of the Equal Rights Amendment in the 1970s was Betty Ford. Yeah. Right? And so again, I think it's important in this moment to remember that we have really heroic Republican women who stood against, incredible kind of forces in their own party for what they knew was right. Often for kind of reasons, as my mom kind of said from Margaret Chase Smith, because they believed it was not only the right thing for our country, but also for their party. And we've been thinking a lot about kind of Betty Ford because it's Breast Cancer Awareness Month.
Yeah.
And one of the things I didn't know until my grandmother got breast cancer was how much kind of our family and every family, the millions of American families who have had to confront breast cancer and our own stories really owe to Betty Ford, for her courage and gutsiness in kind of publicly talking about and showing her experience with breast cancer, and her husband kind of in the hospital standing next to her after her mastectomy, effectively saying, there should be no shame attached to this diagnosis or this treatment, and how profound that was for our country, and how then that became part of our family's story too. But she was an incredibly kind of gutsy Republican woman, and as my mom and I, perhaps not surprisingly to anyone here, frequently talk about, is kind of we wish there were more of them today.
Yeah. Well, speaking of, on a different subject, another place where women both have to fight for equality and have to have a lot of guts to do it is, of course, athletics. I love that you include Abby Wambach in this book. I personally think Abby Wambach is one of the greatest athletes and also fiercest people out there. Yes. So talk a little bit about that, too, because I like the fact that you both talk about sort of heroes in the political world, sort of the thing I'm obsessed with, but also in athletics. You talk about women who happen to overcome resistance to women participating in sports, and equal pay is an issue.
Yes, and thank you to the U.S. Women's National Team for taking this issue on head on. And I loved soccer as a kid, Joy, so much. Although I quickly realized that I had not enough talent to match my love for the sport. But I just kind of was captivated by kind of our American women's soccer team, particularly kind of in 1999, kind of when we won the World Cup, and then kind of the tidal wave that really helped unleash of girls and young women playing soccer. But one of the things that my mom and I learned when we kind of were working on this book was, really how much women's soccer around the world owes to Title IX. That before kind of Title IX, there were about 700 girls who played kind of serious competitive soccer in the United States. Last year there were 390,000. And so many of the women that we watched in the magnificent World Cup that we won this summer had gone to university here, Joy, not only on the American team, but many of the kind of incredible athletes on other teams who were competing. And part of what kind of we really felt so compelled, though, to include kind of Abby's story is that she kind of defines gutsiness for us, that it wasn't just kind of her dream, it was what she felt compelled to do for other women athletes, kind of her just fierceness when she kind of kissed her then wife after that tremendous victory a few years ago, that she was so unapologetically all of herself and said, if you're going to accept my kind of incredible talent on the field, you have to accept like the incredible love I feel in my heart. So just all that she's done for so kind of many of us who kind of love the sport, kind of believe in equal pay, believe in equal rights, I think is really tremendous. So we could not have not included her, I would say.
Well, I have questions here from the audience. I'm gonna throw those out to both of you, and thank you all for sending them in. Lots of people want to talk to you, ladies. So here's the first one. I love this question. What advice would you give to a 17-year-old gutsy woman entering the world? And that's Kavya Desu, who has that question. Who's a high school senior. Do you want to jump in that? Either way.
Great. So I guess the first thing I would say is I love the fact you describe yourself as gutsy. Own that and feel good about it. And it's different for everybody. And that's something that Chelsea and I believe so strongly. We were just talking about an athlete, and before that talking about a politician and talking about activists. Finding whatever your sense of purpose is in your life and then going after it and being committed to it is a big part of being gutsy. Now, we also think for the women that we highlight, making sure you're doing something for somebody else is a really special element of being gutsy. So it's not only what you want for yourself, but how you intend to help others or to provide service. And at 17, I don't know if you're a junior or a senior, but thinking about your next steps, whatever they might be, and being determined to really test yourself, taking courses or pursuing educational or employment opportunities that you are going to find challenging, and constantly, just making it as possible as you can that you're going to continue to grow and that you will keep finding new ways to define your life and create opportunities for yourself. Because these women, they are not perfect. And we make that point absolutely clearly because I believe that too many young women are crippled by their belief they have to be perfect. You know, perfectionism is a disease, and it is something that prevents too many smart, gutsy women of all ages, but particularly young women, to take the risks that might be required to continue to mature and develop into the person you're meant to be. So I'm a big advocate for do the best you can, take stock of what you did, learn from your shortcomings and your mistakes, but don't be paralyzed because you're not perfect.
And I would just add some advice that my mother kind of gave to me that I'll kind of summarize as saying, it's really important to take serious criticism from serious people seriously. The people that you respect, your teachers, your family, kind of mentors, advisors. It's also important to not take serious criticism from unserious people, the people who just want to tear you down, demean you, kind of box you in.
All right. The question, and this is this person that hasn't signed their name, but was it harder to write about living women whose stories are still unfolding than about historical figures? It's a good question.
That's a great question, and you're the first person who's asked us that question, so thank you. Yes, I think there is an additional kind of responsibility in writing about someone who is still alive and still kind of living their life and kind of bringing their gutsiness to bear on whatever kind of issue they're called to, because you don't want it to seem like the story's over, because it isn't. And yet, of course, when you're kind of writing an essay, you do have to have a conclusion. So I think there is a different challenge in ensuring that kind of an essay about a woman who still is kind of working and doing in the world kind of feels coherent, but also clearly is unfinished. So absolutely, I think it's a different challenge.
So I have two young people, one who is 10 named Tess, and one named Arnie who is 13, who both want to know if you're going to run for president again. But I'm not going to make you answer if you don't want to. But I have to read this one, and this person who wrote this is 9, and I have to ask you this because it's so sweet. This 9-year-old, who didn't sign their name, said, I want to be the president when I grow up. What should I study in college? P.S. I am 9. P.S. You're my hero.
Oh, wow, you are a gutsy woman. I love that. Well, if you're 9, I hope that you study really hard between now and college. You take advantage of your education and you read as much as you have time for, because reading gives you a different perspective. It provides an opportunity to really, take your imagination and fly with it, and that you also begin to think about what really makes you excited. The women in this book, some of them knew from the very beginning what they wanted to do. Some of them who were athletes, or Billie Jean King, for example, who started playing tennis as a young girl and just fell in love with it. Others did not come to their purpose in life until later, and sometimes it was a tragedy, like the gun violence stories that ignited that. But one thing is that when they were confronted by the hard work or the risks necessary to pursue their interests, they were prepared. And the best way to be prepared is a good education. There is no substitute for that. And whatever it is you study, whatever it is you get excited about, just go all in on it. Really enjoy the process of learning and have fun along the way. and value your friends and make friends. And if you are getting a little older in your community, look for something that you can do to help somebody else. Because I think you learn as much about yourself through helping somebody else and empathizing, putting yourself in that position as you do in any other aspect of your life.
And I would just add, since we're here in Philadelphia and at the Constitution Center, there are so many incredible places here to help complement whatever you're learning in school. So not only kind of in the obvious sense, as I'm staring at the words "we the people," kind of understanding kind of the history of our country and this still deeply unfinished business to ensure we are a more perfect union. But also, really, I would hope to become kind of literate in the sciences. We're talking about Greta Thunberg earlier, who has just been so stalwart in saying, these are not her opinions, but she's really eloquent when she's talking about kind of what scientists are saying, even though she herself isn't a scientist. One of my great passions is to try to help people understand why it's so important to get vaccinated, and it's flu season. Please get your flu vaccine to help protect those who can't, including my 2-month-old son, Jasper. So please, not only for yourself, but for those who are more vulnerable. And I think in this moment, kind of where facts and truth and science are so under assault, it's really important to be kind of fluent in the sciences broadly, even if that's not what you are particularly passionate about. So please go to the Franklin Institute and take advantage of all of the extraordinary things that exist here in Philadelphia.
Well, I want to thank these two gutsy women, Chelsea Clinton, Secretary Hillary. I always have to give the honorific. You earned it. Secretary Hillary Rodham Clinton. Thank you all for being here. You will love this book.
Thank you.
You will love this book.
Thank you, Joy.
Thank you all very much. And thank you, National Constitution Center.